and didn't know whether to open the door wider or slam it shut. What he saw standing on his porch in the middle of a November storm wasn't something he'd been prepared for. A young woman, soaked through, one boot missing, wearing what had clearly been a white dress at some point in the last 12 hours. Now it was gray with mud from the hem to the waist, torn at the shoulder, and she was holding herself together with both arms crossed over her chest like she was afraid of what might spill out if she let go. She wasn't crying. That was the first thing Brown Ashfield noticed. She looked like someone who had already cried everything out and was running on something harder now. Stubbornness, maybe, or just the cold. "My truck's in the ditch," she said. "About a kilometer back on the Clearwater Road. I saw your light." He looked past her. The wind was driving the sleet sideways across the yard. Beyond the fence line, he couldn't see a thing. "Come in," he said. Her name was Vivienne Caslo. She told him that while he put the kettle on, and she stood awkwardly in the middle of his kitchen, dripping onto the floor, too proud to sit down until he pointed at the chair twice. She was 26 years old. She had grown up in Kamloops, studied veterinary medicine at Guelph, and had taken a position at a small practice in Fort St. Katey, James 3 months ago, which was how she'd ended up driving a second-hand truck through the interior of British Columbia in a snowstorm on what was, she said without further explanation, supposed to have been her wedding day. He didn't ask. She didn't say more. He handed her the tea and set a pair of wool socks on the table and went to check on the cattle. The problem had started 4 days earlier. The Rowan hadn't understood it yet. His herd was 43 head of black Angus, pastured on the south side of the property where a creek ran through a stand of spruce. They'd been restless. He'd noticed them bunching strangely, a few of them off their feed. He'd assumed stress from the weather change. The temperature had dropped hard that week, but by the time Vivienne appeared on his porch, 3 of them were refusing to move at all, and one old cow named Margaret, who'd been with him for 11 years, and who he had no business naming but had, was lying flat on her side near the shelter gate. He crouched beside her in the dark and put his hand on her ribs. She was breathing, but not well. He went back inside. Vivienne was still sitting at the table, but she'd stopped dripping. She had her hands wrapped around the mug, and she was staring at the wall with the expression of someone doing arithmetic on the inside. "You a large animal vet?" he asked. She turned and looked at him. "Yes." "You want to come look at something?" She set the mug down. "Show me." He hadn't expected that. He'd expected her to say she was off duty, or ask what was wrong first, or explain that she didn't have her kit. She did none of those things. She pulled the wool socks on over her bare foot, laced her one boot back up, and put on the barn jacket he found hanging by the door without being asked. Outside, she moved differently than she had in the kitchen. Whatever had been pulling her inward seemed to step aside when she came through the shelter gate. She knelt in the mud beside Margaret without hesitating and put her hands on the cow's neck, then her jaw, then ran her palms slowly down the animal's side. "How long has she been down?" "Since this afternoon. Maybe 2 o'clock. "The others, are they eating?" "Not much. 3 of them. The rest seem fine." She stood and looked at him directly. "Do you use a shared water source? Creek, trough, something that runs through the property?" "Creek, southeast corner." "Show me." They walked a fence line with a lantern. The sleet had softened to a heavy, cold mist. Vivienne said nothing for most of it, just looked, and Rowan found himself unusually unwilling to fill the silence. Something about the way she moved through his property, careful, deliberate, reading things he couldn't see, made him want to let her work. At the creek bend, she stopped. The lantern caught it before he did. A chemical shimmer on the water's surface, barely there, moving with the current. Farther upstream, something dark was lodged against a root cluster on the bank. She waded into her ankles without pausing and pulled it free. It was a ruptured agricultural drum, old, corroded, probably washed down from the abandoned acreage upstream that had been used for grain storage years back. Whatever had been in it was gone now, leached into the water. "That's her problem," she said. She held the drum up in the lantern light, turning it. The markings were too faded to read. "Probably organophosphate residue or something similar. Your animals have been drinking trace amounts of it for days. It's not lethal at this concentration, but it's enough to make them very sick." You need to divert them from this water source tonight. Give them fresh, and call your vet in the morning for blood work. You are a vet. She looked at him. I don't have my kit. You just diagnosed the problem. She dropped the drum on the bank and waded back out. Get them on clean water tonight. Margaret needs fluids. Do you have saline on the property? In the barn. Then let's go. They worked for 3 hours. Vivienne did things she said she couldn't do without her kit and then did them anyway, improvising with what was in his barn, talking through each step in a low, even voice. She was not trying to impress him. That was clear. She was just doing what needed doing because there was an animal on the ground and she was the person who could help it. By 2 a.m, Margaret was on her sternum. Her breathing had evened out. One of the other sick animals had eaten a little hay. Vivienne sat on an overturned feed bucket and pulled her hands to her wet hair and looked at the cow for a long moment. She'll need monitoring for the next 12 hours, she said. But I think she'll be okay. Rowan leaned against the gate post. You want to tell me what happened today? She was quiet for a moment. Not a dismissive quiet, a considering one. His name was Joel, she said. We'd been together 4 years. I'd moved halfway across the country for this job. Partly because we thought it would be a good place to start, somewhere quieter. He came out to visit in August and said it was too isolated, said he'd thought about it and he wasn't sure he could do it. She stopped. He wasn't sure about a lot of things, as it turned out. They called it off today? This morning, about 3 hours before the ceremony. She looked down at her hands. I'd already sent everyone home by the time I got in the truck. I had to drive somewhere. Rowan didn't say he was sorry. He'd learned years ago that sorry was what you said when you didn't have anything better, and it usually didn't help. Instead he said, I've got a spare room. It's plain. The bed's good. She looked at him. Something shifted in her face. Not gratitude exactly, but something adjacent. The recognition that she wasn't expected to explain herself any further. Okay, she said. She stayed 3 days. Not because she meant to. The storm closed the road on the second morning and the tow company couldn't reach her truck until the third afternoon. But Rowan would have let her stay anyway, and she seemed to understand that without being told. She checked on Margaret every few hours, kept a log in the small notebook she'd had in her coat pocket, called a colleague in Fort St. James to talk through the blood work that needed doing once the roads cleared. She was thorough and quiet and completely at home in the barn in a way that made Rowan reconsider some things he'd stopped thinking about. His wife, Lena, had died 5 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 19 months from diagnosis to the end. He'd sold the south pasture to pay for the medical bills and bought it back 2 years later when he'd finally gotten clear. He didn't talk about it much. There wasn't anyone to talk to, mostly. On the second evening, Vivienne asked him about the photographs on the shelf in the hallway. He told her. She listened the way she listened in the barn, fully, without rushing him to the end. How long were you married? She asked. 12 years. Was it good? Yes. He thought about it. Not easy, but good. She nodded, like that was the right answer. The third morning, she was already in the barn when he came out with the coffee. She was standing at the gate looking at Margaret, who was on her feet moving slowly toward the hay. He came and stood beside her and handed her the mug. She's going to be all right, Vivienne said. Yeah. They stood in the cold for a while, watching the cow. I don't know what I'm doing, she said finally. Not dramatically, just plainly, the way you'd say it to someone who already knew. With the job, the town. I moved out here and thought I knew what the life was going to look like. And now the picture's changed and I don't have the new one yet. That's not the worst place to be, Rowan said. She glanced at him. You know what it felt like when I bought the south pasture back, he said. I had no idea what I was going to do with it. I'd sold off the cattle to pay for things, and it was just sitting there. I just knew I wasn't willing to let it stay someone else's. He looked at the herd. It took me almost a year before I bought the first animals. But the land being mine again, that mattered, even before I knew what I'd do with it. She turned her mug in her hands. Keep what's yours, she said, even when you don't know what to do with it yet. He looked at her. Something like that. Her truck was out of the ditch by 2 o'clock. The tow driver gave her a look when he saw the dress still hanging in the back seat. She'd folded it into a garbage bag at some point and shoved it behind the seat. but the sleeve was visible, and she gave him a look back that made him decide it wasn't worth asking about. Rowan helped her get her gear loaded. There wasn't much. A duffel bag, her vet case, the notebook. She stood by the driver's side door. "You should call Dr. Hargreaves in Vanderhoof," she said. "He does large animal work. He can do the full blood work on the herd and make sure there's no residual contamination. I know Hargreaves." Good. She pulled her keys out of her coat pocket. Then she stopped. "Thank you. For the room and for not asking a lot of questions. You answered the ones that mattered," he said. She almost smiled. It was a complicated expression, but it was real. "I'll be in Fort St. James," she said. "If Margaret has any complications." "I know where Fort St. James is." She got in the truck. He stepped back from the door. She rolled down the window. "Rowan." He looked at her. "That thing you said, about the land. About keeping it even before you knew what to do with it." She paused. "I think I needed to hear that." He nodded. She pulled out of the yard slowly, watching the ice on the gravel. He stood in the cold and watched the truck until it was gone around the tree line. He called Dr. Hargreaves the next morning. The blood work came back 2 weeks later. Trace organophosphate exposure, no lasting damage to the herd. Margaret, the report noted, was in remarkable health for her age. Rowan drove to Fort St. James in the second week of December. He told himself it was for supplies. He stopped at the veterinary practice on the south end of town and walked in, and the receptionist told him Dr. Caslo was with a patient but would be free shortly. He waited in the plastic chair by the window and looked at the mountains through the glass and felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, even though he hadn't planned to be there. Vivienne came through the door in her clinic coat and stopped when she saw him. He held up a small paper bag, brought something for Margaret. She looked at him. "Margaret's at your farm." "I know. These are carrots. I was going to take them to her when I got home, but it seemed like you should know she's doing well." There was a long pause. "You drove 4 hours to tell me your cow is doing well," she said. "Road conditions were fine," he said. "Wasn't far." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "I get off at 5. They had dinner at the one restaurant in town that was open on a Tuesday in December, which was a Vietnamese place run by a family from Hanoi who'd somehow ended up in northern BC and made a broth that was worth the drive on its own. Vivienne talked about her first weeks on the job. The strangeness of the landscape. The silence that she'd expected to hate and had instead found herself grateful for. The animals that were different out here. Rangier and more self-sufficient. Like the land had made them that way. He talked about Lena, not the way he usually told it, carefully, at a distance, but the way it had actually been. The grief, and also what had grown after it. The years that had been hard and then slowly, unevenly, not as hard. She listened. She didn't try to fix it or frame it or find the lesson in it. By the time they were done, the restaurant was empty except for them, and the family from Hanoi was resetting the tables with the polite patience of people who had seen this before. Outside, in the parking lot, under a sky that was hard and clear and entirely full of stars, Vivienne turned her collar up against the cold and looked at him. "I'm still figuring out what the picture looks like," she said. "I know," he said. "Me too." She nodded slowly. "Okay." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. It was something quieter than that, the kind of thing you only say when you trust someone enough not to dress it up. The following spring, Vivienne began splitting her time between Fort St. James and the Ashfield property, where she'd started consulting on herd health for 3 ranches in the valley. It was practical, she told her colleague in town, who gave her a look that said he wasn't fooled. She bought a proper kit for the barn. She kept a second set of wool socks there. Some mornings she would be up before Rowan, standing at the gate with her coffee, watching the Angus move through the early light, and she would think about the night she'd driven away from everything she thought she was building and ended up in a ditch on the Clearwater Road. She didn't regret it anymore. Not because the pain had been worth it. It had just been pain, and pain didn't need to be worth anything. But because what she'd found on the other side of it was something she never would have known to look for. A place where the land asked something of you. A man who understood that some things take time to become what they're going to be. and a stubborn old cow named Margaret, who was, by all accounts, in remarkable health for her age. I keep thinking about the drum in the creek. The corroded, half-buried thing that nobody had noticed for years, quietly leaching into the water, quietly making everything sick. Nobody meant for it to be there. It wasn't dramatic. It was just damage that had been sitting long enough that people stopped seeing it. That's what a bad ending does, I think. Not the loud kind. The kind where someone leaves you 3 hours before a ceremony and you're standing in a parking lot in a dress that suddenly means nothing. That part is loud enough. I mean what comes after, when the shock settles and you're driving somewhere, anywhere, and you realize you've been drinking from a poisoned creek for a long time without knowing it. The slow kind of wrong. The kind that takes a while to name. What I find remarkable about Vivienne isn't that she survived that day. Most people survive their worst days. What stays with me is what she did in the first hours of it. She didn't collapse. She didn't perform courage either. That frantic, performative kind where you're really just running from stillness. She walked into a stranger's barn in the middle of a November storm, and she looked at a sick animal, and she thought clearly. She used what she knew. That's not a small thing. That's what it actually looks like when someone has built something real inside themselves. When the knowledge isn't just credential, it's character. When the hard years of learning become the thing that holds you upright when everything else lets go. And Rowan. He made space without making a fuss about making space. He didn't ask her to explain herself or perform gratitude. He just pointed at the chair twice and put the kettle on. That kind of decency is quieter than people realize. And rarer. It takes a certain kind of person to understand that sometimes what someone needs is not to be questioned or comforted or fixed. Just to be let in from the cold and given something warm and left alone to breathe. What happened between them makes sense to me because of what each of them had already done before they met. Rowan had stayed. Stayed on land that nearly broke him, bought back what grief had forced him to sell, built his herd back one animal at a time. Vivienne had moved across the country for something she believed in, even when it cost her the shape of the life she'd planned. Those aren't accidents. Those are choices that accumulate. They become the kind of person you are, slowly, without announcement. I think we underestimate that, the weight of the small choices. The decision to get up and check on the animals even when you're tired. The decision to keep the land even when you don't know what you'll do with it yet. The decision to stay in a town that's quiet and ask more of yourself than the comfortable version of your life would have required. Those decisions compound. They become, eventually, the thing that lets you walk into a dark barn at 2 a.m. and know what to do. Vivienne ended up building something she never would have planned. That's not luck. That's what happens when you're honest about what you're capable of and willing enough to stay in the hard place long enough for it to become something. The poisoned creek got cleaned up. Margaret got better. Some things, it turns out, just needed someone with the right knowledge and enough nerve to wade in.